Right. So, what we discussed in the previous session about,
Data types.
I'm talking about, I think, data types. If I'm not wrong, that's what we have discussed. Right?
Yes, sir. Data types only.
Different data types we have, right? So that's what we have discussed.
Yes.
Now, today I'm going to discuss about the conditions in Java. Because whenever we are working on the Java programming, especially whenever we are trying to understand about the scripting part in context to that as a prerequisite of programming itself is concerned, normally in this programming, it's not only about the data types, either it can be primitive data type, right? So all that, right? So even conditions also important, means what are the conditions are we going to provide when you're writing a program, and how is this important, and what are the different constructs we have. So all these things we need to know, because conditions something like this is where, for example, if condition, right? So or else it can be a switch condition, or else it can be ternary, right? So there are different conditions will be there. So whenever we try to understand about any kind of conditions and all, normally conditions will be categorized in three different things. Let me write down here. Conditions are as follows. Conditions are as follows. The first condition is called if condition, right? So if is one condition. There are many things, because again, if condition again will be connected even with the statements also. What are the different statements, like looping statement, right? Branch statements, everything, right? So let me explain you this first to you. Okay, if condition is the first one. So next condition is called switch condition. And the next one is called ternary, right? So these are the three different conditions will be there in any of the Java code when you are going to write, because as far as the conditions we need to apply when we are developing the code. Because if you want to develop a business logic, whatever the data types are required, either it can be integers, decimal, boolean, right? These values, these are all important. In addition to that, how the conditions has to be implemented. Now, in context to this, normally there are some constructors will be there. Normally, when it comes to the Java programming, there are different constructions. I think you might have heard about classes, right? So objects, right? So
Yes, sir.
methods.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
These
I
are
heard
the
about this.
terminologies normally we use. So these are generally we call it as programming constructs. So as far as the programming constructs itself is concerned, constructors or constructs, right? Constructors, I can say. Right. So as far as the programming constructors are concerned, yeah. So as far as the programming constructors are concerned, generally programming constructors are four. The first one about the class. This is where generally we use is called class file, etc. Because for example, if you want to write any kind of statement, generally this normally we start with class. Class is a statement which normally we use. For example, class student or something like that. That's how generally we use it. So
Okay.
class is one kind of programming constructor. Normally, whenever we are writing down the condition for a logic, we have to do it. The second one is called variable. This is where we call it as variable declarations, because we have to create and declare the variable so that people can identify where the variable was, so that based on that logic can be implemented accordingly. So the next one about the constructor, this is where it is, right? So right, so next one about the constructor, because under the constructors, right? So this is also one of it, right? It's class variable as well as the constructor. And fourth one is important one is called method, because we need to write down the methods, because whatever the four constructors I have explained you, because these are all comes under the OOP part, WOP, which is called object-oriented programming. Because if anybody wants to have the programming knowledge, object-oriented programming is the one. Normally using these constructors, normally whatever the logic we are going to write for any kind of methods and all that. So these, in this logic, when we are writing down the logic and all that, so we have to deploy these conditions and as well as loops in this, because some classes we have to be mentioned in the program. Some variable declarations has to be provided. At the same time, some constructors we have to use. At the same time, some method classes and all everything are something which we have to be used with. Okay.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to the statements, because conditions is what something I said. For example, if, switch, ternary, right? These are the conditions I told you. But when it comes to the statements itself is concerned, normally statements will be varied of different statements, like either it can be a jump statement, or it can be an selection statement, or it can be a loop statement, or it can be a branch statement, right? There are different list of statements we have to be taken with, because normally if else condition, nested if condition, right? So at the same time, switch condition, case, default, ternary, operators, right? The different conditions we use, because on a high level note, if, switch, ternary are the three classifications. But again, in if is there, again if else is there, nested if is there. Okay, switch as separate, switch case is different. Okay, like this ternary itself is again as different. So ternary operators are different. So there are a lot of conditions are there, especially whenever we are writing down the Java programming. So in this regard, it's always important for us to find out what are the different statements and where and what are the conditions are we applying for these statements. Normally, statements in Java, when we are writing down a programming, statements in Java are as follows. So there are different statements which normally we use. The first one is called looping statement. The first one is called looping statement, for loop, right? All these things are comes under this category. Point number 2, next one about the branching statement. Next one is called branching statement. Next one, yeah. So next one is called control flow statement. Next one is called control flow statements. No, statements, right? So control flow statements. Next, after control flow statements, next is about selection statements. Next, iteration statements. Next, jump statement. Right, so jump statements will also be included in this, right? So jump statements and all. Next, last, it's not last, but normally I can consider it's a decimal Montel value statements will also be there, right? So these are the different statements normally we have whenever we are working on the Java. Means if you want to write down a statement means if you want to write some business logic for a particular functionality, there is some statement we have to write, right? So if you are to write down the statements, normally different statements like loop statement will be as separate, for loop, etc. At the same time, branching statement, for example, if you want to break that statement, or if you want to continue the statement, or if you want to return to the existing one, for example, you are executing the code, right? So wherein you want to come back, right? So these are all definitely which normally we call it as return statements and all that. So these are the major things which normally we have to understand when it comes to the looping statements itself is concerned. These are the different statements we need to do. Now, as far as the looping statement, what are all comes in the looping statement, right? The first one is about for loop. You know, I think you might have heard about for loop.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right. So next is enhanced for loop. Enhanced for, right? So this is next while loop, do while, Okay, these are the different loops which are comes under loop statement. Means if you want to write down the loop statements, under for loop will be used, enhanced for will be used, while, do while. These are all comes under looping statements. Next one about the branching statement. Branching statements nothing but, for example, if you want to break a particular statement and we have to continue further. So break statement is being used. Next one is called continue statement. Means if you want to continue the statement, generally continue is what something which will be used. And return statement. Return statement is the one which normally we use when we have deploy the code, or when we have execute a program will be executed, and again it will go back to the previous starting point. This is where we call it as return statement. It has to go back to there. Okay, this is where generally we call it as return statement all about. I'll give you an example from the calculator point of view. I want to make it very simple for you. For example, you have given some math calculation, 25 plus 35 plus 26 plus 98 plus. Finally, whenever you are clicking on the final button, what will happen now, right? So you will get the result. Am I right? You get the result. For example, getting the result for all the additions of the numbers what you have given.
Yes.
Maybe the final output, right? For example, some x amount of x number will come. Now, whenever you are pressing on the escape button, what will happen automatically? Your calculator will go on to the 0. Yes or no, right? So why? Because the calculation is completed. Once the calculation is completed, what we have to do again, if you want to perform another activity, what you have to do again, you have to go back to the previous stage where 0. From there onwards, either if you want to do it additions or subtractions, multiplications, additions can be done accordingly. Understood, Karthik? Clear on it? Karthik, listening? Karthik, are you there? Okay. Are you there, Karthik? I don't hear you at all. Okay, right. So these are all we call it as branching statements. Next one about the control flow statements. Generally, control statements normally
Hello?
Yeah, Karthik.
Hello? Yes, sorry, sir. I lost my network.
Okay, right. So this is what we call it as branching statements. Okay, break, continue, return, all these things are comes under
Yeah, oops.
branching statements and all. Next, what is control flow statements? For example, you want to break up a flow, right? Follow the execution of an employee decision making, or looping if you want to branching the enabling, right? So your methods and all everything. For that, normally, if you want to create a blocks of the code and all, generally this control flow statements and all everything are being used. Means if you want to, for example, however, right? So for example, however, right? So however is a condition normally we use if you want to break up a follow-up execution, right? So this is where generally control flow statements and all everything will come into picture. So looping statements, for loop, enhanced, for while, do while, right? All these are looping. So branching nothing but break, continue, returns, etc. will be comes under that. Control flow means however and all etc. Everything is being used for the control part. Now, when it comes to the selection statement, normally what selection statement do is that selection statements majorly allow us to program the kind of changes in any kind of different parts of the execution we want to do, okay, based upon the kind of outcome of an expression. So for that, generally, whatever the kind of state of variable we are going to use, for that generally selection statement is being used. Because selection is a statement, majorly we want to we have to use it somewhere where if you want to change any kind of patterns. For example, if you want to change any kinds of path settings you want to do, right? Let's say, for example, if you want to deploy a code, right? So if you want to deploy the code, there are some path settings which we have to be updated. So once we have updated the path settings, what we have to do, we have to deploy the code and we have to show. So if there is any kind of
Yes.
changes in the different parts of the execution, based on the kind of outcome what you want to see or the output you want to see, for any kind of expression, whatever the kind of expression you are going to execute here, for any kind of variables, whatever the variable declarations it is, either it can be a class, it can be variable, it can be a constructor, or it can be a method you are calling. So for everything, generally selection statements are being used. Next, iteration statements. Iteration statements means majorly iteration statements are the one which majorly enable us to program the execution part, wherein if you want to repeat one or more statements, right? So for example, multiple statements if you want to execute, right? So for that, generally iteration statement is being used. Next is jump statement. Jump statement majorly used when we are working on the, for example, we are writing some construction statements, right? So for example, select is what generally are we using, right? So some select statements and all, everything we are using. So in this regard, generally, whenever we are using the select statements, etc., all that, whatever the kind of jump statements, right, from one logic to another logic, if you want to jump the particular variable or as well as the declaration and all everything. So this jump statement is what something which normally we use it. So this is one more thing, right? So this is what we call it as jump statements are. Next, at the same time, as I already mentioned you, branching or transfers, and at the same time, I have discussed about even iterations, right? So iterations means iterations, I can say, iterations are loops, I can say, right? So for example, like whatever the for loop statements do we have, right? So iterations and as well as loop statements are almost one the same as what we have used. Everything will be used in this regard. Next statements, one are important statements. These are the primary statements. Whatever if else, nested if, at the same time, switch means switching from one to another, right? At the same time, switching the case from one to another. Next, if you want to provide some default results, for example, some default result you want to provide. Or at the same time, if you want to provide any kind of ternary operators and all everything. So these are the different statements which normally we have to write when you are going to create any kind of statement for any of the program. Now, normally, if you want to create a class, for example, as in when I mentioned you, right? So as far as the programming constructors itself is concerned, there is a class statement which we have to use it. Now, if you want to use a class statement, this is how generally we do it. A typical class statement normally looks as follows. Okay, so how this class statement usually looks, this is what something we have to know, because class statement is a common statement whenever we are working on or whenever you are using the statements. Normally class statement is what something which normally we use it. So when you are creating a class statement, for example, we are mentioning about the records of the customer, records of the students, marks records, right? So everything you want to. So here we need to call a class statement, wherein whenever we are using the call statement, except usually whenever we are using the call statements, right? So when you are using the call statement, first of all, you need to mention even not only the customer, the student, at the same time, you want to mention the integer age, right? So for example, integer age is what something which you have to be mentioned with. Means because age is a number, normally will be represented based on the integer. Next, we need to mention the string name as well, right? So whatever the string name do we have, so that even we have to be used in this regard. Next, we need to mention the student, because you want to mention about the student age or something like, for example, so based on the data, based on the date of birth, or automatically it will detect. This is where generally we have to call upon. For that reason, generally this is where we have to be used with, right? So this is what generally the statement of student is what something we need to use. Now, if you want to call this functionality, wherein here we need to write down the age. This is better. Yeah. So we need to call for an age where this age is equal to age of the number, because normally here there will be a default number will be given. What will be the default number? Default number will be starts with 0. Okay, because that is the least number wherein we can give, right? So from there onwards, whatever the number of a particular age and all, everything will be called upon. At the same time, it's not only about age, even we have to call even the name also. This is where generally name we have to be used even. So whenever we have used the call function name statement here, we need to display the string, right? So that is required. So string display, we have to use it. We have to use the string display of the student. Right, so we have to use the string display of the student, where here we need to be mentioned about the logic here, right? So we need to mention the logic. So this logic end of the day has to be moved into a return home. Return home statement we want to use for particular business logics what we are implementing. So here we need to mention about the here we need to mention about the age. Okay, this is what something we need to use it. So once it is done, again next the statement has to be closed in this manner. So this is how generally a class statement which normally we want to provide. Means if you want to provide a class statement for a particular for a particular conditions, right? So what you are using, whatever the conditions are we using, whether it can be constructors, including the construction like class statements and all everything. This is how generally typically we have to use the class statement so that people can develop the code based upon the class statement. We have to write down the simple condition, because simple if condition is what something we have to write, because majorly simple if condition wherein you need to call the public classes also. There are different public classes followed by the strings and all everything we have to be mentioned with. At the same time, finally, we need to be executed and we need to be provided with system outprints. So that is where generally simple if condition comes into picture, because that is the basic if condition statement of a program which we have to write in the Java. That is the basic basic minimum thing, because if conditions, because different conditions we have to write, so if or if else, nested if, etc. So if is a condition which is normally used for the simple if condition to execute that I'm going to discuss you tomorrow. Okay, on Monday.
Sure, sir. Yeah, sure.
And I think I've already forwarded the previous recordings to you. If I
yes, sir. I got it.
Okay, we'll meet on the same time, 10:30. 10:30.
Sure. Yeah, sure, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.